women would get their children, strap them into a life vest, and throw them overboard to try to save their lives. And what happened was that in order for the life vest company to meet the safety standards, the life vest would have to be a certain weight. Well, what they would do is they would stick iron bars. They had stuck iron bars in the life vest, so inside the cork, so they could say, "Oh yeah, it's the amount, right? That's the right amount of cork." But it
That's
wasn't.
horrible.
They had put iron bars in the middle.
Ugh,
So mothers were throwing their children overboard to save them, and what happened is that the children would sink right to the bottom,
ugh,
because either the cork would all fall out of their life vests or the iron bars would take them right to the bottom.
jeez. So, welcome to another episode of WTF History. It is such a joy to have you here. We want to thank you for your tremendous amount of subscriptions. David tells me we're up to 16,000 subscriptions, and every episode is getting over 100,000 views. So, thank you. All right. So, wait, now you've got a fascinating travesty or a fascinating tragedy, something that
Yeah, yeah.
you
I mean, I think yours was a little more global. Mine is a
yours is
little
more
more
local.
local. Yeah, mine's a little more local. What I want to talk about is, and and there are some follow-ons to this, but it was the worst maritime disaster in the United States until the Titanic, which happened, I think, like 8 years later. Very, very, very soon afterwards. I always hate doing stuff like that because it makes it seem like there's a contest, right? It's like when you talk about serial killers and you're like, well, he was the worst serial killer. And it's like, dude, it's not a league. You know
Well, but
what I
yeah, but
mean?
wait a second. But the point should be though. The point should be that every American, you say name a naval disaster, they'll say the Titanic.
Yeah.
If someone
But for
really knows
many
their
years,
history, they'll say the
yeah.
Maine or the Lusitania.
But
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 nobody
yeah,
knows about
right.
this one, right?
Yeah, yeah. What you should be saying is the General Slocum. And many people will say the General Slocum because I think there has been, as of recent, a lot written on it. The General Slocum. First of all, there are two sad parts to this. It There is the horrific tragedy, right, of the General Slocum, but then there are two sad parts, and one of those is the killing off of an immigrant community in New York City, and secondly, kind of the burying of the name of an American who actually, of all the people I have researched as I do history, these shows, and other things, like, he was one of the most impressive dudes I've ever researched, and I only know his name because they used his name for the ship in which almost 1,400 people died. And
Fascinating.
it's like, and it's sad, right? Because but that's how history is, right? You don't get to choose your ending, man. It just history hands you your story. So first of all, I'd like to start by identifying a guy who really is someone that history needs to remember, and that's the United States Army General and Congressman Henry Warner Slocum. He was born in upstate New York, later moved to Brooklyn. He was a general that you can actually say was everywhere. He was like one of the
Yeah.
key assistants to Sherman on Sherman's march to the sea. He was a key general in Gettysburg. He was everywhere that he needed to be in history and on the winning side and at the right time. So he was pretty amazing. And just in his military career, then he went and was elected to Congress. His first term was between 1869 to 1873, and then he decided not to run again because he was an attorney. He made a pretty good living, great investor, and he lived in Brooklyn. And so he was really, remember, at this time, Brooklyn was its own city.
Yeah.
It wasn't a borough of New York City. And so he really helped build Brooklyn up. He reformed the Civil Service Commission. He tried to get rid of a lot of the dirty hijinks that go on in civil service commissions at that time. He was an early investor and proponent of the Brooklyn Bridge to connect Brooklyn to Manhattan. In fact, there are plaques with his name on there
Now, hold
because he
on. I got
played
to
such.
interrupt. I got to interrupt and ask because this is one of those guys where it's like, he led a battle on the prairie. He became governor and then senator. He
And then he
founded
died at
a
37.
telecom company and then he died at 32.
No, this is not
Yeah.
one of those. It's kind of funny, man. But I think those stories all take place like west of Missouri.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah, this is Brooklyn.
So this
But
guy,
yeah,
this guy
no,
lived a two. He had a gray beard at some point.
he had a good life. Yeah, he had a good life. And then he ran for governor. I think he ran for statewide office. He didn't get it. But then he went back to Congress. The people said, "No, we need you." He went back for one more term, and then he came out. And then he died a nice, well, it wasn't a nice death. It was, I think, liver cancer. But he passed away in 1894. So well respected, Mike, that the Knickerbocker Steamship Company in 1891 decided to name their paddle wheel steamboat the PS General Slocum.
I like it.
And what's unfortunate, and the reason I went into General Slocum so deeply in the beginning was because that was a great guy. And history has totally forgotten about this dude, except his name was used for the ship, right? It's like if the dude, let's say there was a dude named Titanic and he had like cured cancer. And like, but you only remember him because like, ah, that's the ship that went down. I feel really bad. I
But
feel
that is
bad
so
for
true.
General Slocum,
That
but
is
I
so
felt I owed it to him to give a little bio there. So the Knickerbocker Steamship Company was kind of they ran excursion ships. And for those of you who don't know, you know what an excursion ship is, right, Mike?
I'm assuming it's a short trip of a short duration,
Yeah.
taken. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly that. It's an excursion ship. Like we want a ship to take us up to the tip of Long Island to have a picnic. Let's rent the PS General Slocum. And the Knickerbocker Steamship Company did that. And they did that in 1891, 3 years before the general passed away. He was that good, right? They didn't wait till he was dead to name after him.
That's
They
amazing.
did it like they did it right while he was still alive. So the steamship, it was powered by, it had two steam boilers under the deck, and then it had three cabins, big, large cabin storage rooms under the deck, and then it had three platforms. It had the main deck, the promenade deck, and then it had the hurricane deck. So, and it could fit up to 2,500 passengers,
That's a
though
big
the
ship.
yeah, it's big and big and flat.
Yeah.
Kind of like some people's heads that I know. And so and so people would rent the General Slocum to take date, like you said, daily excursions, go around the island, you go to one, you know what I mean? You take it all over and you do a picnic, you take it up to Coney Island. Well, the Knickerbocker Steamship Company had a history of not being the greatest owners of steamships. So, just the General Slocum. Now, first, I'm offended by how they have besmirched his name by creating such a shoddy ship and naming it after him.
Right.
But let's just look before the accident. 4 months after it launched, it ran aground. Uh, and people had to be rescued. July 1894, it struck a sandbar and broke off its electrical generator because it did have electric lights. In August 1894, it ran aground on Coney Island, right, one of those picnics. In September of 1894, it ran into another ship, knocking out all of its steering. I would have hated to have had that to be carrying that insurance policy, by the way.
But I'm trying to
um,
figure out as you go through this laundry list, is this bad design or is this a bad captain or bad captains?
Yeah, good point. I don't know. I can't tell because they're all like the same stuff. In 1898, it collided with another ship, took very serious damage. In August 1901, 700 drunken anarchists. And what says 1901 like drunken anarchists?
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
Yeah. William
Like
McKinley. Yeah.
like that is so 1901.
Yeah.
700 drunken anarchists tried to take the ship over, and the crew was able to fight them off and hide in the pilot's cabin.
Wow.
And then in June 1902, the ship ran aground and had to camp out on an island all night until the passengers were rescued. And it also had a history of being run at about twice its normal capacity. So my point of all that, Mike, is to say that the Knickerbocker Steamship Company and their ship, the General Slocum, had a history of being run in a very shoddy manner.
Yeah.
This was the ship that was commissioned by the women of the St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church in Little Germany, which was a very quaint community in Manhattan, of German women. They're, German immigrants and, multi-generational Germans. They all lived in this place called Little Germany. By the early 1900s, there were about 50,000 people of German descent living in this area. Very, very vital community. They did a lot of these things
They had
together.
enough people that they could fill like a 1,400 person ship?
Not just that. Well, there were, as I said, there were about 55,000 people, the
That's amazing.
historians say, in little Germany at this time.
Huh.
And these were just the women and children primarily of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. They commissioned this ship, and it was an annual trip that they made. This was the 17th year. Not always this ship, of course, right? But they would get a ship, and the ship would take them around, and they would do a picnic on Long Island.
Look, I have a lot of friends, but I'm not sure I could get 1,400 people to fill a ship. I mean, this
Yeah,
this is like, these are like big organizations, like concert style stuff before there was shows like that, right? Like,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That's a lot of folks, but
This is like the Fire Island with much more tragic consequences back in.
yeah,
Yeah.
much more, man. So 1,400 passengers boarded the General Slocum, and it was going to go up the East River, across the Long Island Sound to Locust Grove, a picnic area, in Eaton's Neck, Long Island. So up only out of the 1,300 passengers that were on there, not counting the crew, um, fewer than 150 of them, fewer than 150 were males over 21. Of those 1,400 that got onto the boat, fewer than 150 of the passengers were men over the age of 21.
Wow.
So that means that you were either a woman or you were a young adult or child. Most of them were very young children because this was really a women's church event,
Wow.
taking all the kids out for a picnic. By and large, most of them were children.
Ugh.
So the ship took off from the East River at about 9:30, and as they were going, about 10 minutes after the ship took off, people started noting fire that was
Huh.
coming up through the floor planks. So the ship left the pier on the East River at about 9:30 that morning, and as it was passing East 90th Street, a fire started in the lamp room under the main deck. Now, what the forensic folks who later looked into this found out was that the fire was likely caused by a discarded cigarette, in the lamp room, and the lamp room was chock full of straw, oily rags, and lamp oil that was just laying around. It's like it was just they should have renamed it the fire room, to be
Seriously.
honest, because that's essentially what it was. It was a fire room waiting to happen. So the first people to notice the fire were about 10 a.m. So about half an hour after they took off. And but what we learned later was that a child, a 10-year-old, had actually gone to the captain, Captain Van Schenk, and he had told him, "Hey, there's a fire," but the captain ignored him because the captain thought he was just effing around.
Jeez.
So he kept going on and like, shut up, you're bothering me, kid. He did whatever, like, steamboat captains would say at that time. But once he realized that there was actually a fire, here's what Captain Van Schenk did. Captain Van Schenk decided to go full speed ahead down the Sound or down the East River to try to get to the place where they were going. So Captain Van Schenk thought, well, I'll just run this out, right? Well, what Van Schenk should have realized was by going full speed ahead, he was actually feeding the fire. So he fed the fire. I mean, Mike, you could see that, and you're not a steamboat captain
No.
anymore, right? You gave that up a little while ago.
Yes, I did.
So he's feeding the fire, and not only is he feeding the fire, but he's pushing the flames now because it started in the front of the ship, but he's pushing now the flames to the back too. So witnesses say that within 10 minutes, the entire ship was just engulfed in
Ugh.
flames. So Van Schenk then had to try, once he realized that he wasn't going to make it there, he had to try and go over to the island, right? To try and try to dock somewhere on the island, run it aground so people can get off and he could quit feeding the flames. So the passengers now, you have almost 1,400 women and children, primarily women and children here in this woolen clothing, right, Mike? I mean, remember what they wore at the times, these layers and layers of woolen clothing. And they're out on the ocean, right? So they're probably dressed very warmly with all this wool on. Well, they don't know what to do, so they start going over and they start taking off life vests. Well, most of the life vests were nailed to the wall the Knickerbocker Steamship Company had done a horrible job of keeping up the safety. The the lifeboats were often nailed or painted to the wall of the steamship. Now you would think a steamship with this much of a shoddy history would, have a little more activity with their, their emergency drills and equipment, but they didn't. So what would happen is that passengers would pull off the life vests, they would put them on, and because they had been sitting there for 13 years and had never been used and had never been switched out for, ones that worked, the cork in them had dissolved
Oh,
and the cork would just fall out like powder because the material would just rip
geez.
apart. Remember, we're talking the early 1900s, so it's a very different type of material.
Sure, and stuff is
Then,
weather beaten. So, I mean, you live by
yeah,
the
yeah,
ocean
right,
and you realize it deteriorates really fast.
correct.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. It was weather beaten. It had been sitting nailed to a wall. So the ships they couldn't access any of the lifeboats because the lifeboats were nailed or painted to the walls. The life vests, women would get their children, strap them into a life vest, and throw them overboard to try to save their lives. And what happened was that in order for the life vest company to meet the safety standards, the life vest would have to be a certain weight. Well, what they would do is they would stick iron bars. They had stuck iron bars in the life vest, so inside the cork, so they could say, "Oh yeah, it's the amount, right? That's the right amount of cork." But it
That's
wasn't.
awful.
They had put iron bars in the middle.
Ah,
So mothers were throwing their children overboard to save them, and what happened is that the children would sink right to the bottom
ugh,
because either the cork would all fall out of their life vests or the iron bars would take them right to the bottom.
jeez.
So as this happened, all of the passengers are moving to the aft part of the ship. All of these people, remember, almost 1,400, they're almost all entirely women and children, out on a church outing, right, on the East River of New York City. As they're doing this, as they go back, well, obviously, if you know anything about the Knickerbocker Steamship Company by now, you know they don't have the greatest craftsmanship.
Ah,
So the entire aft part of the ship falls into the flames below.
oh, jeez.
And so they said that at least 300 people died simply when the aft part of the ship collapsed into the flames below decks. So the captain by now, he gets the ship, he grounds it, but because he's in such a hurry and he's just trying to save his own ship captain, he doesn't take care in how he grounds the ship. He grounds it nose in. Well, as you know, if you're going to ground it nose in, that means if you're jumping off the front, you're going to be fine. But if you're jumping off the back, you're probably going into a much deeper part of the river. And that's what happened. So, all of those people that managed to survive falling into the inferno below the aft portion of the deck, they all now started to jump off of the back of the ship, not understanding that the back of the ship, there was no thought into where it was placed, and they all jumped into the water. As soon as the river water hit their woolen clothes, they were taking right to the bottom. They
God,
were just almost all they went directly to the bottom of the river, dying in numbers. The numbers I have say about the three to 500 people died simply by trying to save themselves by jumping over the what they thought was what they were supposed to do. So you got
jeez.
to think about all the hell that these people have been through now, Mike, right? I mean, and remember the ship only took off at 9:30. We're now like, what, 10:20.
Oh,
So all of
jeez.
this happened so fast, right?
So
Now
you're
tugboats,
just getting used to this idea that you're on this beautiful, harbor cruise to go to a picnic, and within an hour you're going through basically an hour of terror.
an hour of pure unadulterated terror.
Yes.
From the people who fell into the bottom, into the, below decks inferno, to the people who jumped off the back of the ship and went immediately to the ground, to the children and mothers who jumped over in life vests that they thought were built to save them, but in fact they were built to save money and never changed out, who also sunk right to the bottom. There
Jeez.
were a couple of tugboats that had seen this happening on the river, and so the tugboats started making their way, and the tugboats actually did a very heroic job of trying to save a lot of people, and they did save a lot of people. It's estimated they pulled believe between 2 to 350 people from the
So that
water,
was gonna be
these
my
heroic
question. Like,
tugboats.
how many people died total, and how many people survived?
Yeah, there were 431 survivors
Amazing.
total. over 1,200 over
Now
no,
was the captain one of them?
1,021 people died.
Whoa.
Um,
Was the
and
captain one?
the captain, once he saw the tugboats, he jumped onto one.
Oh,
So
jeez.
the captain immediately jumped once he saw a tugboat within jumping, distance, and did not go down with the ship. Didn't do anything. He jumped on. That was Captain Van Shank, and he saved his own self.
Jesus.
There was a hospital nearby, and a lot of the workers from the hospital heroically ran down and created a human chain into the East River,
Right.
and they created this chain, and they would be trying the best they could to pull. You could only imagine how heavy a human being is in this, these layers of woolen cloth that are
Sure.
now
Sure.
completely imbued with this, East River water. So, they were probably incredibly heavy, but they really did a good job too. At the end
That's
of the
amazing.
day, 1,021 people burned to death or drowned. 431 survivors. Um, the captain, as you know, he survived because he jumped into a tugboat. Didn't go down with the ship. Didn't try to save his passengers. He just got on. He just got on the ship as soon as he could. By the way, 8 people were indicted, Mike,
I see.
by a federal grand jury after the disaster. The captain, 2 inspectors, and the president, secretary, treasurer, and commodore of the Knickerbocker Steamship Company were all indicted. But no one was convicted except for the captain,
No.
and he even only for one charge of criminal negligence for having faulty equipment. So over 1,021 people died,
Jeez.
and one dude was held liable, and it was just for faulty equipment.
So, you know, by reaction,
Nobody
besides this being, you've stumped me again. Usually, when we do, look, we're both history buffs, and usually when we do a show like this, I know a little something about the topic you talk about, and you know a little something or a lot about the topics I talk about. This is something I had never heard of, but also at the same time, with all the movies made about the Titanic, this is something that is like begging to be made into a movie. It's got all the
this
elements
is the
of foreshadowing and
dude.
core planning and this and that, and
Yes,
like
it's got the
evil
evil
guy.
captain,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
You got the heroic mothers and children of, passengers. You've got the heroic hospital workers with the human chain.
yeah.
You got the tugboat guys. I could pick a couple actors right here. Who's the guy? You got them right racing out there to save them. You've got the you've got the dirty steamship owners. By
Yes.
the way, the Knickerbocker Steamship Company only ended up paying a very small fine, again because of the missing some of the safety equipment. The General Slocum was the worst maritime disaster of the 20th century until the sinking of the Titanic surpassed it 8 years later in 1912. But it remains the worst maritime disaster in New York City history, and the worst maritime disaster on U.S. waterways. It's important. This story was important to me because I had never heard about it,
Yeah.
and I'm like, people need to know about this. People need to know about the horrors, and people need to know, have we really learned anything with some of these companies, right?
Yeah.
Who to save a buck, they're willing to risk all of these lives. Mike, I got three follow up things. So one is no, these aren't follow-up questions. I wouldn't do that to you. Here's a test. Um, the remains of the barge, because of course they're the Knickerbocker Steamship Company. They went and got all the remains of General Slocum, and they built it into a barge called the Maryland. And then it was a commercial barge that they used, for commercial stuff. And it sank to the bottom of the South River in 1908.
Crazy.
And then they raised it. They raised the Maryland. Remember, the Maryland is made out of the remains of the General Slocum, right?
Right.
And it sank 4 years later, and they raised it. And this time in the Atlantic Ocean, on the south of the coast of New Jersey, near Sea Isle City, it sank again in a
Okay, that
storm
wood
on
is
December 4th.
cursed. That wood is cursed. Let's not use that wood anymore.
1911. So only 2 years after the Maryland sank, it sank again, and this time the Knickerbocker Steamship Company said, "Eff it,
So
that
rightfully
that wood is haunted." What's really sad about this, though, Mike, is that this really was the end of little Germany in Manhattan. A lot of the people, and you're like, well, it's a community of like 55,000, right? And only like 14, 1,300 or 1,200 people died. Like, how is that? Well, these were pretty much the civic leaders. These were the families of some of the most important people in Little Germany in Manhattan. They were a lot of I think you can call them the social foundation, right? These were the
Sure.
people who belonged to the
Plus
church,
their
and
kids.
they
Plus their
yeah,
yeah,
plus their kids. It was an empty area after this, right? Then the people also started turning against one another.
yeah.
Whose fault was it? Who decided to do that ship? You
So
should have done your work. And then they started fighting over the money, because there were, this Knickerbocker Steamship Company did have to pay out some.
sure.
Insurance companies had to pay, and then they started fighting over who would get what. So it really did rip apart what was known up until that point, the vibrant community of Little Germany in Manhattan.
Yeah.
At the same time, the Jewish population from Russia in Eastern Europe was starting to move in, the Yiddish speaking Jewish population, and they were moving them out. And so most of the people who at once were this very, very vibrant little Germany, they all left. And then most of them went to Brooklyn, and dispersed in Brooklyn, and, just did their own little individual German thing. And
Awesome.
the area became a predominantly Jewish area. In fact, in 1940, the St. Mark's Lutheran Church became the Sixth Street Community Synagogue.
Fascinating.
So as of 1940, nothing existed from the community that
Wow.
once rented that ship, right? The entire community was dispersed, and the church that was there, was gone. On January 26, 2004, the last surviving passenger from the General Slocum, Adela Witherspoon, died,
Fascinating.
and, she was 9 months old, at the time. Or I'm sorry, she was 6 months old at the time of the wreck, and her 2 elder sisters had died in the wreck,
Jeez.
and she lived until 2004.
Amazing.
And that is the General Slocum disaster, and I just really feel that it's a story that needs to be told.
Absolutely.
Um
David, thank you. I mean, this is something that should be a movie. Fascinating story. Is something that should make everybody out there say, WTF, that we don't know about this. Um, but I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you like and subscribe.
Hey, if you like what you hear, like and subscribe. It really means a lot, and we would love to have you coming back every week. Thank you.